Okay, welcome back everyone to Chapter 23, Capitalism and Culture, a New Phase in Global Interaction since 1945, as we cover the globalization of liberation, and our focus is on feminism for Section 2. Okay, the idea of liberation traveled around the world in the 20th century. The 1960s in particular saw a convergence of protest movements around the world, suggesting a new global culture of liberation. In the United States, there's a huge civil rights movement where youthful counterculture anti-war protests took place. In Europe, protests against unresponsive bureaucracy, consumerism, middle-class values, especially in France in 1968. Within the communist world, there's an attempt to give socialism a human face. In Czechoslovakia with the Prague Spring in 1968. In China, Mao Zedong launched his Cultural Revolution. There's also the development of the idea of a third world. The dream of offering an alternative to both capitalism and communism is like a cultural renewal. And the third world ideology was exemplified by Che Guevara, who died in 1967, with efforts to replicate the liberation of the Cuban Revolution through guerrilla warfare in Africa and Latin America. And among all the liberation movements, feminism had the most profound potential for change. It was a rethinking of basic relationships between men and women, and it began in the West in the 19th century with women's suffrage. So now let's go to feminism in the West. Organized feminism revived in the West in the 1960s with a new agenda. They stood against historic understanding of women as other or deviant. They demanded the right of women to control their own bodies, and the agenda of equal rights in employment and education. Women's liberation took a broad attack on patriarchy as a system of domination, and there was a consciousness raising amongst the masses, becoming aware of oppression and open discussion of issues, especially involving sexuality. Simone de Beauvoir, The Second Sex, written in 1949, the French philosopher, restarted the feminist movement in the West, which had largely died down after achieving the vote, and Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique in 1963. This American author called attention to the ways that middle class women were unfulfilled with their lives. So this more radical manifestation of feminism protested the symbols, rituals, and practices of patriarchy as beauty pageants and beauty products. And they claimed that women were not merely sex objects. But it was a little different for black women who emphasized solidarity with black men as opposed to a separation from them. All right, feminism in the global South. Women had been welcomed in communist and revolutionary movements, but were sidelined after the movement's successes. And many African feminists, especially in the 1970s, thought Western feminists were too individualistic and too focused on sex. And so for many women, especially those living in conditions of poverty, mainstream feminism was a debate within a particular family that did not speak to their concerns of race or even class, in addition to gender. And they resented the Western feminist interest in cultural matters like female circumcision and polygamy. And many African governments and many African men identified feminism with colonialism. Now, not all women's movements dealt explicitly with gender. In Kenya, women's group movements supported individual women and communities. In Morocco, feminist movements targeted laws defining women as minors. Women finally obtained legal equality in 2004. Chile, women's movements during Augusto Pinochet's dictatorship from the early 70s all the way to 1990 crossed the class and party lines that helped groups survive economically and exposed human rights abuses. And so the women in the nationalist and communist revolutions, they were recruited as part of the struggle, and they often failed to live up to the promises. The communist governments failed to live up to those promises of liberation once they were in power. And feminists from the global south criticized Western feminism as a product of its unique culture and thus too focused on individualism and sexuality and not on cultural identity and motherhood and material issues of poverty. And women were also involved in larger struggles. The global south women's groups were frequently key players in movements that were not specifically gender issues, such as standing up to repressive dictatorships. And that takes us to international feminism. The quote-unquote woman question became a global issue in the 20th century. Patriarchy lost some of its legitimacy. The UN declared 1975 as an International Women's Year and declared 1975 to 1985 as the Decade for Women. The UN sponsored a series of world conferences on women, and by 2006, 183 nations had ratified the UN Convention to eliminate discrimination against women. And so women's rights are seen as human rights. There's been a concerted effort to address women's rights on the global stage, making them universal to human rights. And that UN Convention to eliminate the discrimination against women in 2006 was a high water point in international discussion of women's rights. But there's a lot of division and backlash. There remain many divisions within the international feminist movement, often related to issues of religion and culture. And feminism has always produced a reactionary backlash in certain areas. So there are sharp divisions within global feminism. Who has the right to speak on behalf of women, and the conflict between developed and developing nations and their different interests. And the third world groups often disagree. And the global backlash to feminism has allowed some to argue an agenda that undermined family life and relations between men and women, as it fueled religious revivalism in the Muslim world, for example. And some took exception to emphasis on reproductive rights. So let's take a look at this image. Who are the people in this photograph, and what are they doing? Well, these young women are protesting sexual discrimination, macho culture, and sexual violence in Brazil. And they're holding signs that state, among other slogans, that their bodies are theirs and theirs alone. And some men can be seen in the background supporting the women's protest. So why do these women choose to march as dressed the way that they have, as stated in the caption? Well, the protesters chose this self-deprecating title because they wanted to draw attention to their right to dress as they pleased, that their choice to dress in sexually provocative clothing did not give men the rights over them, and that rape victims, for example, were not responsible for their attacks. So, which aspects of this feminist prospect might have drawn criticism from other feminists? Well, some feminists in Europe and the United States in the 1960s would have rejected sexualized fashion as part of the subjugation of women. And feminists from the Middle East might judge this protest misguided and demeaning toward women. And still other feminists in Africa would point out that women needed to secure their equality and property rights first. So while the right to women's self-expression in fashion has not been a universal cause among feminists, women's rights to their own bodies certainly has. And that sums up the globalization of liberation, focus on feminism. And I will see you for religion and global modernity.